Hello, and welcome to our podcast on another great literary term that we'll be seeing in the next unit, and this is the term of paradox. Let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So here is a definition. It says a paradox is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. And so we've given you some synonyms for some of those bigger words in there. And so it seems like a paradox is something that when you first look at it, seems completely ridiculous, silly, can't happen. But then when you give it a couple seconds, maybe a couple minutes, maybe a couple of hours of thought, you can see the deeper connection there. And you can say, hey, even though those things don't seem to work with each other, they actually do. And there is a deeper meaning here, and there is a deeper point. So before you go on, make sure that you can write that definition down in your own words. It's a pretty complicated one, it's a little confusing, but make sure that you truly get it in your own brain and can put it down in your own words. So then isn't paradox juxtaposition? A paradox often uses juxtaposition to create this seemingly contradictory thing that upon further reflection shows that it's not all that contradictory. And so you probably need juxtaposition to an extent to make that fusion start. But then once you think about it, you can see that there is actual meaning there. So there's probably going to be some amount of showing of contrast, which is juxtaposition. But it seems to me as I try to conceptualize it, juxtaposition is just the contrast of things, whereas paradox actually moves to the next level and implies meaning, a little bit deeper meaning upon further reflection. So again, how do we find these things? We always want to be reading actively. We want to make sure that as we're reading, we are engaging our brain in the process, we are connecting, we are visualizing, predicting, questioning, all those great things we've talked about, and so that we are reading actively in our texts. And then we need to look for things that seemingly contradict each other. Not just contrast, like big and small, but that actually outright contradict each other. So seemingly say and imply the opposite. We should slow down our pace at that point. We should think about what we're looking at. And then we need to figure out or deduce, why would the author do that right here? What does this do for this text? What is the author trying to say or imply? So as always, we have to do A first, which is just identify that there might be something here that's a paradox. And then B, we have to give it a little bit more further thought and contemplate how does this relate to the text as a whole. Why do paradoxes matter? As always, this is just another one of these great lit terms that we want to put into our toolbox so that we can identify what authors are doing to further their exploration of theme. As we've said before, most themes are not going to be directly expressed. We don't have the answer for theme on page 52 of any book. They don't just come out and say, in case you missed it, this book was about how good should always overcome evil, etc. They just don't do that. Authors in pieces of literature or film or in poetry are going to imply their theme. It is our job to sift through all of the stuff to figure out what is that lesson. And oftentimes, authors are going to help themselves reveal their theme through the use of paradox, where they're going to, in key situations, show us something that's so contradictory that once we can figure it out, we can see, oh, that's why they put that there. They want us to get this lesson. Therefore, that is the theme of this text. So here's a quick example of paradox, almost kind of oxymoronish in that we just have a quick contrast. But an example of a paradox might be the idea of a jumbo shrimp. At first thought, we look at that and go, wait a second, you can't do that. You can't have a jumbo, meaning big of something, and it also be shrimpy. Shrimp being another word for small or tiny. So we can't have a jumbo shrimp. But then when you take a breath, step back, and think about it for 30 seconds, you look at it and go, okay, they don't mean shrimp in this case as in a size thing. They mean shrimp as in an animal from the sea. Okay, now we can justify that. It is possible to have a jumbo shrimp. It's possible to have a really big small crustacean from the sea. Okay, that makes sense, and we can move on. But at first glance, that is a paradox. How do you understand those two seemingly contradictory things that don't make any sense? give it some more thought, and they do make sense. Here's another example from a pretty famous book, Animal Farm by George Orwell. In this line, he says that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And if you've read this book, you can recall that this is the idea of how the animals have taken over the farm, they have expelled the humans, and they have chosen to rule themselves. Yes, it is an allegory for the Russian Revolution, and so we see those themes running through it. But we also have this line, which is a great paradox. How can all animals be equal, but some be more equal? Well, in pure communism, everyone would be equal. At the same time, in practical communism, meaning how it actually worked in the world or didn't work in the world, was that some people kind of rose to the top and said, well, we have to have some leadership here, so that's going to be us. And then by becoming the leaders, they became a little bit more, quote unquote, more equal than others because they started to get certain privileges and rights and things like that. And so this line was uttered by one of the pigs, who was saying that, yes, we are all equal, but some of us, especially the pigs, we are more equal than you guys. And so you can see the seeming contradiction there, that once you think about it in the context of this book and this text, it starts to make some sense. Some more examples here. If somebody were to come up and say, man, I'm nobody. First, it doesn't make any sense, because if you're here and there are words coming out of your mouth, then you are somebody. Therefore, you can't be nobody, or we wouldn't hear those words. But then you can step back a little bit, be reflective, and go, well, what do they mean by the words, I'm nobody? Oh, okay. They're just saying that they're not feeling important that day. So they're using the word nobody, not to mean a physical, corporal thing, like here I am as a person, but in terms of I'm not important. So then we can get behind that phrase and understand it, so that they're saying, I'm nobody. Upon further reflection, that does make some sense, and we do accept that as a statement. So as we move on to a couple more of these, go ahead and stop the podcast every once in a while and challenge yourself a little bit. What is the paradox here? So the seemingly contradictory elements, and then give it some more thought. And what does each one mean once you actually get into it? So go ahead and stop them now and challenge yourself a little bit here.
Tall and tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes.
Hopefully you've had a little bit of practice now with paradox, and some of those are becoming a little bit more clear once you stop and think about them. Let's go ahead and tie this back into the text we'll be reading soon, and so where paradox really comes through in a literary and textual way. Here's a question for us. Is it acceptable in a free society like the United States, where we say that we have multiple freedoms, exceptional freedoms, almost universal freedoms, is it okay in a society like that to have a military draft, where the nation comes in and says, you are now forced into military service because of such and such a conflict or such and such a need? I think this is a great example of paradox. How can you on one side say we are a free society and then turn around and have a draft where we are forcibly taking away people's freedom of choice by saying you have no choice? You are going to serve in the military for X amount of time. So again, go ahead and pause the podcast and think about that as a potential paradox. Again, another example here directly from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. It says, I survived, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to war. And I think we have a great paradox here. You have two of them. You have him saying, I survived the war, clearly, because he's writing the book. But then you say, it's not a happy ending. Well, how could it not be a happy ending? You survived, you're alive. Many of your buddies did not live. 58,000 Americans did die in this conflict. So you're saying you survived, but it's not happy? What do you mean by that? That seems very paradoxical. Also the next pair, I was a coward. I went to war. Wait a second. Don't brave people go to war? Aren't they the people who said, yes, this is the right thing I need to do. I need to add to my country's war effort. I need to thank my nation for my freedoms, and I repay that through my service? Then how could you have I was a coward right next to the sentence of "I went to war." That seems paradoxical. And so as we read this text of the things they carried, you'll see this a little bit more. You'll see the context behind this statement. When we take it out of context like this, of course it's a little bit weird and you don't have the full backstory. But once you read the chapter that this belongs to, you can see that A, it is a paradoxical statement. It's a paradox. But B, what does the author intend by this? What is his deeper meaning by putting these things next to each other and seemingly contradicting each other? So that's it in terms of paradox. Please remember that we have these terms of paradox and juxtaposition and irony, kind of all very similar and close to each other. And the point of all of these literary terms is for us to understand more terms and identify what we see, but also ask ourselves, how are authors using these terms to further reveal their theme? Certain authors tend to develop their themes in some ways. Tim O'Brien, for one, tends to rely heavily on the term of paradox. So as we read his next novel, make sure that we're paying attention, looking for those, and then asking for that deeper meaning and connection to theme. As always, thanks for listening. Hope to see you soon. Bring in any questions you have to class, and we'll go from there. Thanks a lot.